Being a marketer's no sweat. You just have to manage dozens of channels, launch hundreds of campaigns, score thousands of leads, and okay, fine, it's a lot of sweat. Unless you have HubSpot's AI-powered marketing tools to help you do all that and more. Get started at HubSpot.com/marketers.
Hello dear listeners, welcome to an impromptu edition of Achtung Millwall. My name is Nick Hart. I'm speaking to you in the depth of the belly of the international break, which seems to go on forever, dear listeners. And I thought, sitting here idly watching the cricket on the telly, that it might be nice just to revive an idea. I used to do these little random fixture from the past shows, didn't I? And I haven't done one for a long time, and I thought it's high time that I got it going again. So here we are, and I've decided that as we're playing Derby County this coming Saturday at the Den, it might be nice to pick, not quite at random, but an equivalent fixture from the past. I've chosen Millwall 1, Derby County 0 on the 3rd of September 1988, played in the First Division. Notable, of course, all you older listeners will know this very, very well. Younger listeners, this was our first ever home game in the top flight. We'd been promoted a few months earlier, and this was the start of the we played Aston Villa the week before away, but this was the first home game at Coldblow Lane featuring first division opponents. A 1-0 win. I remember the goal well. There is YouTube footage of the goal. It was a scrappy game overall, as I recall, and the goal itself is a scrappy effort from the right-sided free kick, which I think Dennis Salmon and George Lawrence are standing over. They put the ball into the left side. It's headed back across the face of goal, and there is the master, El Maestro, Teddy Sheringham, to slot home from very, very close range. 1-0, 44th minute for that goal, and that was how it stayed. And it was an explosion in the Den that day, dear listeners. 13,000. It was a big crowd back then. Big crowd back then for us, including me, 13,061, so I was that one. And it was a frenzy of excitement, shall we say. We would follow it up, I think it was a week after we played Everton at home, which was the first game against what would be described as one of the big six at the time. I know Everton have fallen on tough times in recent years, but back then they were still seen as they'd been league champions not terribly long before that, so they were amongst the elite of the game. But this game against Derby, who I think had been promoted the season before us, I haven't checked that, so any football nerds out there can take a look at that and tell me if I'm wrong. But they were first division opponents and a formidable lineup. Let's have a look at the Millwall lineup first of all, then we'll come on to the Derby County 11. So our starting, there was a classic lineup. We've covered this team over these kinds of shows many times, but I'll make no apology for doing so again, because it was the glory days of my Millwall supporting career. So anyway, for the Lions, in goal, Brian Hall, the back line, Danny Salman, Alan McCleary, Steve Wood, Ian Dawes, I think had not long joined us. I think he joined us when we were promoted from QPR. Good player. He was playing in Danny Mack's style. It was played on the left and was a right-footed defender, ideally. But anyway, there it was. So Salman, McCleary, Wood and Dawes. Midfield, Hurlock and Briley. On the wings, Kevin O'Callaghan, replaced in the 80th minute by Jimmy Carter in this game. George Lawrence on the other side. Up front, who else but Teddy Sheringham and Tony Cascarino? That has got to be an iconic lineup, dear listeners. And, like I've said many times over the course of these shows, days that will be forever seared into my memory. This was the first of a wonderful few months, really. It was a strange season, if you look back at it, because we were actually contenders, although I'm not sure we didn't truly believe ourselves to be contenders for the league title itself. Amazing as that sounds. Certainly going into February and March of 1989, we were still in the mix. It all went badly off the ball. We'll come back to that later after we've considered this fixture. And we would finish in 10th position that season. when much more was promised. In all truth, managed of course by the one and only John Docherty. Derby County, though, this was this one of the great memories I have as a Millwall fan of that season, and it might sound a little odd to younger listeners, I don't know, but it was the sense, it was the fact we were being covered in the media. I mean, nowadays we live in a deluge of coverage, and you 24/7. I'm not sure it's always a good thing that people can live and breathe Millwall football generally all the time. But back then, you had the daily newspapers to go by and a bit of TV and a bit of radio, but you didn't get much coverage in the second and third tiers of football, which is where we'd spent the majority of my time, all of my time, as a Millwall fan. So to go into the first division and get coverage in the mainstream media, TV would be there. As a matter of course, this was unusual back then. I mean, there was that sense that suddenly we were amongst the big time, I think, and we were playing opponents, Derby County, which included names like Peter Shilton in goal. I'll run through their lineup, actually. I found it on the 11 versus 11 website. So Peter Shilton in goal, England player, £1 million goalkeeper for Nottingham Forest, European Cup winner under Brian Clough. World Cup goalkeeper. So big names. Took a broadside of abuse, of course, at the Den. So Shilton in goal, Mel Sage, Paul Blades, Mike Forsyth, Mark Wright, another very strong defender. England 86, and I think in Italia 90. Was he not in defence for us when we went to the semi-finals in the Italian World Cup of 1990? Strong player, played for Liverpool as well, Southampton. Trevor Hebbard, Gary Micklewhite, Geraint Williams, Nigel Callaghan, Watford player at some point, one Paul Goddard. We'll come back to Paul Goddard, dear old Paul Goddard. He would go on to become a record signing later on after this, but he played for Derby that day, Paul Goddard. And John Chidozie, there's a name from the past, a Nigerian international. They're showing a Nigerian flag against his name on the website here. I mean, it was that sense that you were playing in the big time, and so we were, and it was just something so far outside our collective experience that I think for a while in the first division we existed on a collective adrenaline ride, a roller coaster, and there were games like this, Everton, the Forest game, where it just seemed like you're in a dream, and all dreams come to an end, dear listeners. And so it would do in the first division. I've got a match report here. This is from the Burton Mail, and it's quite a decent. I'll read it out, actually. Why not? You've got nothing else to do. You tuned in. Let's have a listen to the match report from the Burton Mail. Derby failed to silence the Lions' roar, says their correspondent. When the Rams were thrown into the Lions' den, it was not a day for the faint-hearted. In a no-bolds first half, tackles rained in fast and furious, earning bookings from Mel Sage and Paul Blades. A blood-splattered Mark Wright, his head gashed in the opening seconds of the game, bellowed instructions from the back as his side battled to hold themselves under intense pressure from the Millwall forwards. It was a historic day. A First Division game had never been played at the East London, South East London, not East London, the East London ground, as they put it. And straight from the whistle, Millwall determined not to allow the occasion to get to them. But this was not a problem expected by Millwall boss John Docherty, who wasted little time in praising his own team. He said, I had no doubts after the performance last week against Aston Villa. That was a 2-2 draw, listeners. First ever game in the First Division. But John says if they were going to freeze, it would have been then, last week. I think we surprised a few out there today. Names on paper don't mean anything to me. It's how they play on the day. After 90 minutes, you have to ask if you are good enough for this division. And after 2 games, I think our players have shown enough. All round, it was a first-class team performance. And so it goes on. The pace at the game began certainly rocked the Rams, says their reporter. After just 3 minutes, Millwall new boy Ian Dawes floated the ball over the Derby defence, putting Kevin O'Callaghan clear through, but he could only knock the ball into the thankful arms of Peter Shilton. Again and again, Millwall threatened, and with a quarter of an hour gone, the Rams' offside trap backfired for George Lawrence, but Peter Shilton stood between him and the goal, and it was the England goalkeeper who won the battle of nerves, pulling off a one-handed save. Derby held on until the closing seconds of the half. 2 minutes into injury time, Jules Lawrence floated a free kick into the box. Kevin O'Callaghan steered the ball from Shilton's grasp, and Teddy Sheringham had the easiest of tasks to knock the ball into the unguarded nets. Second half, Derby searched for the breakthrough, and within minutes of arriving on the scene, John Chidozie brought a fine save from Mill goalkeeper Brian Horn. Having gone so close, G, that's one of their players, looked to be Derby's saviour, but the former Gresley Rovers hero suddenly turned villain of the piece 10 minutes from time when he stabbed his shot wide of an empty goal after Nigel Callaghan's through ball had totally wrong-footed our goalkeeper, that's Brian Horn. Nick Pickering tried hard after replacing Gary Micklewhite, but the sun-soaked Millwall crowd were rewarded with their first ever win in Division 1. So we were, and it was a wonderful day. Strange experience looking back, being promoted to the first division. I do remember hoping that we didn't know how we were going to get on in the top flight. You know, Mill had never been there before. We'd come up as champions, but it all seemed to happen quite in a rush at the end of the 87-88 season. We'd been contenders, but the actual promotion and then being champions kind of popped out of nowhere. My only real hope, if I'm going to be honest with you listeners, would be that in the top flight, we'll get a win, at least get one win from the season. Don't totally be embarrassed. And we weren't totally embarrassed. In fact, we were the complete opposite. We were amazingly in contention for the league title after Christmas and into a chunk of the new year. And it all went a bit off the rails at the end of the season, as we've said. So there's the report. There is YouTube footage, as I've said. Some of it's pretty fuzzy. There is one or two clips on YouTube of the goal itself that gives you a good sense of the, of the day itself. Strange, really, looking at the crowd. 13,000 doesn't seem terribly high in our modern eyes. And the goal behind the Ilderton Road end is quite sparsely populated, but there it was. That was a good crowd by the standards of the day back then. I've picked out a few players, 3 players actually, from our starting 11. Danny Salmon. I don't think we mention Dennis very often on these shows, so I thought maybe it might be a nice chance just to put that to rights. Dennis Salman, defender with us, 1986 to 1991, 112 games, 5 goals. Born in 1960, he's a little bit older than me, Dennis. His career took him Brentford in 1977, Millwall, sold to us for £20,000 in 1986. Then he went on to Plymouth in March 1990, Peterborough, Torquay, until he retired from the game. These details are from Neil's book, The Millwall Who's Who. And I'll read the little biog that they've done of Neil, Neil's done of Dennis Salman. Danny started his career at Brentford, where he became the youngest ever Football League debutant, making his debut for Brentford, listeners, 15 years old, 15 and 243 days, so just a few days short, really, of his 16th birthday. He helped the Bees win promotion from the 4th Division in 1978 before reuniting with his former boss, John Docherty, in New Cross. He was Lions Player of the Year in 1988, the title-winning campaign season. Dennis ended his career in the West Country, where after working as a commercial manager at Torquay, he ran a dry cleaners. He's also provided stats for the Press Association, worked in the media, and owned a soccer school. Dennis Salmon, really strong, honest player of the year, as the piece mentioned there. One of those players, I think John Docherty had a few. I mean, Herlock would be another one that he also brought from Brentford. These were kind of rocks in John Docherty's side. And Danny Salman was one of those players that would never let you down, would run and run and run. Almost a Jimmy Abdou style of approach to the game. Different players, different positions entirely, but different styles in many ways. But that same willingness to run themselves into the ground. And that was Danny Salman. And I don't think we've mentioned him very often, but it was a very, very strong part of that promotion season and then the First Division campaign. I've also picked out, we mentioned the name Paul Goddard, and he's for the opposition in this game, of course, but you can't go past Paul Goddard without mentioning him in a Millwall context. Our record signing in 1990, just short of £1 million. I don't think it was quite £1 million, but it was 990,000 if memory serves. 800,000 it's shown here. I thought it was more than that. Very well rated striker. It was one of the most Millwall signings ever, and it's still mentioned even to this day. You know, the Millwall in the transfer market and the folly of big money signings. We've never been very good with them, it seems to me. And Goddard probably is the classic example of that. With us for 2 seasons, 1989 to 1991, played just 25 games and scored twice. And I do have the privilege, dear listeners, of being able to say I saw at least one of those goals, and that was the Manchester City FA Cup tie, which I think is the following season to this one. We played Man City in the FA Cup third round, and the ball went in off his backside, and I saw it as a Coldblow Lane. So I can say at least, you know, that was £500,000 of a goal there. But he'd had a good career. Played at QPR, 1977. West Ham, his big name. You know, West Ham, Newcastle, he'd done well there. Derby County, as we've mentioned, for this particular occasion, in 1988. He left us in 1991 to go to Ipswich Town as a coach, joint manager of Ipswich in 94. West Ham's assistant manager in 2001. England international, Paul Goddard, he'd helped bitter rivals, as the piece says here from Neil's book, West Ham, to a Division 2 championship in 1981, and became the Lions' record signing, arriving with a very creditable reputation. He did, you know, when we signed him, I mean, the West Ham thing never really, you know, it dogged him throughout his time, of course, but that could have been got past if he'd have scored goals. It just didn't happen. His spell is at the Den is seen as nothing short of a disaster, as Neil's book puts it, and I've got to agree with that assessment. It was a disastrous signing for us, probably a disastrous signing for him, really. He did arrive with a good track record, and there was nothing wrong with the signing if you are able to put to one side the Hammers connection. After failing to win over the fans, that's an understatement, Neil. After failing to win over the fans in his 13 months with the club, Paul moved on to Ipswich Town on a free transfer. So from 800,000 to a free transfer. That's very Millwall, isn't it? He became a youth team coach and then had a spell as assistant manager at Upton Park. He's now working as an agent for a leading sports management company. So there we are. Paul Goddard, a legendary name for all the wrong reasons at the Den, but a comparatively strong career in the game. There we are. Now I've picked out one last little piece that struck me is that the Derby County that day was sponsored and have the word Maxwell written on their shirts. Now, older listeners will immediately know that means Robert Maxwell. Younger listeners might know who Robert Maxwell is. And anyone that's a keen student of the news will know that his daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell, is currently doing 20-odd years inside a New York State penitentiary for her association with the sexual predators of, what's his name, Epstein. No, not Brian Epstein, he was a Beatles manager. What was his first name? Can't think of his name. But anyway, Epstein, the kind of sex scandal that's bedeviled the great and the good in many, many countries, USA and UK. And that was his daughter. But Robert Maxwell was a crook, thieved money from the Daily Mirror's pension fund. It was a major figure in British life and politics through the 70s and 80s. A self-publicist, a fascinating figure. I've read his biography, and I find him fascinating as a person. How far a crook can go in this life, and somehow be amongst the great and the good. Dear listeners, I don't know if that's making any sense. But Robert Maxwell bought into Derby County mainly not for any love of the game. He had no love of the game at all, as far as I can tell. And reading some of the Derby County fans' forums, that was quite apparent. He was basically seeking approval, rather like the old Roman emperors had to lay on public games for the entertainment of the people. I think he saw himself in that role as a kind of a provider of bread and circuses for the people. And he was at this time owner of Derby County. He would go on to buy into Oxford United. He had the plans to merge them with what was it, Reading? They were going to merge them into Thames Valley Royals, one club. He had all sorts of plans and schemes, money-making schemes to his own benefit and self-aggrandisement. And it just struck me that there's the name Maxwell across the Derby shirts, a notorious figure in British public life. He would eventually die. He fell off in mysterious circumstances. He fell off his boat in the Canary Islands. Some believe with a heart attack. Others speculate in conspiracy areas. But yeah, fascinating figure, a man of many roles and guises and names. His story is well worth looking into. I recommend. There's a number of documentaries. I think there's some on Netflix and Amazon. There's audio books. You name it. He's a fascinating figure. But that was who was sponsoring Derby County for our first ever home game in the First Division. There we are. Millwall 1, Derby County 0. Hope you've enjoyed this little revival of the random fixture. I might do another one next week. If you've enjoyed it, do let me know. And if you have any Robert Maxwell stories you want to share with us, send them in. Why not? Let's have a listen. I do know that I listened to Neil Bradley's podcast, and he worked at the Daily Mirror, and I think he has scathing views on Robert Maxwell for the reason the pension thievery that took place to prop up his wealth. He was an empty vessel basically, and he had to find money from other places, and that's where he found it from. There we are. That's the end of the Millwall v Derby 1988 show. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'll be back at the weekend after Saturday's home game. Until then, dear listeners, from me, Nick Hart, it's Arrivederci Millwall. Bye for now.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.